very damaging to your collections and can cause, complete and total loss of everything in your collections. I don't know how many of you have heard about the big fire that they had in Brazil, in the Brazilian National Museum recently. Well, they had no inventory of their collections. They don't even know what they lost. And one of the things they've done is they've gone out and they've asked people to send pictures that they've taken of their collections as a way to try and inventory what it was that they lost. So a big part of disaster planning is actually doing things like inventorying your collections, knowing what you have, having a list of your staff members, knowing what numbers to call in case of a flood or a fire. There is actually a really nice free online disaster plan. It's called DPlan, www.dplan.org. When you first look at it, it probably will look a little overwhelming to you because it's quite comprehensive. But it will go step by step and ask you to bring together various institutional information, including things like having an inventory, things you can do to prevent, having plans in place for response and recovery in the event of a disaster, what supplies you should have on hand, and then the training of your staff. And in addition, and all of this creates your disaster plan, and then you have to maintain your disaster plan because staff changes and materials get old and you have to replenish your fire extinguishers, things like this. So it's not sort of sexy, this is probably not the most interesting information in the world, but I'm trying to give you a sense of all of the work that goes on behind the scenes in the museum to preserve all of these things that we're then being able to show and preserve for generations to come. So let's see. So another, we've talked about these sort of natural disasters, but I would say the majority of damage that happens to artworks are actually from humans, not from disasters. And it has a lot to do with objects not being properly handled and not being properly stored. So proper handling is very important and goes a long way in preventing damage to your materials. So whenever we have new staff come to our museum, the conservation department does handling training for anyone who is actually going to be responsible for working with the artworks. And it usually covers these are some of the basics, using clean hands when you handle artwork, using gloves. For many materials are extremely sensitive to the oils in your fingers. And once you get your fingerprints on them, things like photographs and metals can be etched by the oils in your fingers. You want to use both hands when you're handling things. If you grab something by a corner, there's a chance you could break a corner off. You want to try to avoid touching surfaces that have paint or media because, again, your fingers can be quite damaging. For us in the museum world, we want to have a clean work surface. Wherever we're working, we want to make sure everything is clean and neat. No food or drink in any areas where you have artworks. It's really easy for accidents to happen, for a cup of coffee to get knocked over, and believe me, getting coffee stains out of art on paper is not very easy. So you don't want to have that happen to your precious materials. And then you also want to use carts when you're moving artworks around. You don't want to be carrying things in your hands because what happens if you trip and fall? So these are all the sorts of things that we're thinking about when we're working in the museum. Storage is equally as important. And in fact, if you don't have really good environmental controls wherever you are storing your artworks, using things like boxes, folders, and storage cabinets, all of those layers of protection can help slow down and mitigate the fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity that you might not be able to control so well. And then additionally, Think about, this is actually for people who have collections at home. Think about where you're storing them. Try to avoid places like the attic where it might get very hot, or the basement where it might get very damp. Of course, those are the places most people want to store, that's where you have your room. But if possible, try to avoid that. And then if you do have to store in those areas, you try to use a lot of this sort of buffering material to help protect your artworks. Excuse me. Also, when you're buying things for yourself, you really need to be careful and do your due diligence in understanding what the materials are that have been used to create the boxes and the cabinets and the folders and the storage materials, because those can be poor quality themselves and can off-gas or be acidic and can actually help the sorry, I've lost my words. It will, oh my gosh, will make the deterioration worse. Thank you. And so when you're looking for archival materials, even if something says it's archival, just be wary and really look into it. And these are some of the keywords that you want to look for in the materials that you do want to use when you're storing your artworks. So you can either use paper or plastic sleeves or folders, but the sort of plastic that you want to use, it's very specific. You want to try and look for these three materials, either polyester, polyethylene, or polypropylene. And sometimes the brand names are called, for polyester, are called Mylar D or Melanex. What you want to avoid is anything made of polyvinyl chloride, PVC, because that's going to off-gas harmful fumes that will speed up the deterioration of your artworks. For those of you who collect photographs or have photographic albums, you really want to avoid these albums called magnetic albums. I don't know if you're familiar with those. They have sort of strips of glue and then plastic cover sheets, and you peel the plastic cover sheet back and put your photos on, and then put the cover sheet back. Those are very, very bad. Once you have your photos in there for 5-6 years, they're going to become almost impossible to remove without damaging them. In terms of paper enclosures, you want to try and find things that are 100% cotton rag. Other keywords to look for are things that say that they're lignin-free or acid-free. And then a lot of materials for that say they're archival might say that they're buffered. A buffer is just something that's adding a slightly alkaline material to your folder, and that's put there to help combat any natural acidity in the materials that you might have. However, you don't want to use buffered folders for a lot of photographic materials. And that's because some photographic materials actually don't react well to alkalinity. And so it's just easier to remember not to use buffered for all of your photographic materials, rather than trying to remember which photographs react and which don't. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about display. Because displaying your objects, you also want to use materials that aren't going to off-gas harmfully. And the materials that you use, you want to be good quality materials. These are just two examples of the sort of framing system we use at our museum, as well as a nice cradle that's been made out of polyester for displaying. At home, you might want to think about avoiding hanging your artworks over a fireplace where you're going to get a lot of heat, or over radiators, or in your bathroom where you're going to have a lot of moisture collect and could potentially get mold growth. And although it can be a little bit more expensive, if you have things that are really precious to you and important to you, you might want to consider using UV filtering plexiglass or glass when you frame and display objects, because again, that will help cut out the ultraviolet light, the damaging ultraviolet light in your materials. When you're displaying art on paper, it's really important to put them in a protective mat when you're going to put them on display. And the mat serves a number of different purposes. So this is sort of a typical storage mat. You have a back mat and a front mat. The front mat has a little window opening. The purpose of the back mat is it acts as the support for your artwork. Once you have your artwork attached to a back mat, you never have to touch the art itself anymore. You can move it around using the support. The purpose of the front mat is actually to act as a separation between the art and your glass or your plexiglass cover, because you don't want the glass or the plexiglass directly touching your artwork. You can, if you have any moisture at all, you can get sticking of the paint and then have paint loss when you try and separate them. We do what we call, there are all sorts of different ways that you can attach your artwork into the mat. And it's also very important, let me say, that you want to hinge your artwork to the back mat, not to the front mat. If you attach your artwork to the front mat, when you go to open it, you're going to damage your artwork. So you just want to make sure always that you have it attached to your back mat. Again, there are lots of keywords to buying good quality materials for matting. 100% cotton rag. Sometimes they use the term alpha cellulose. They also will sell something called a bleached wood pulp. Wood pulp is not usually as good a material to use because there's a naturally occurring material in wood called lignin that is acidic. However, if they bleach it, that usually removes the lignin, which will make this slightly better quality. And if you have no other options, it's better to use, than something that's completely acidic. The other thing is you want to be really wary about mat boards that are colored because they might have the dye that was used to color them might bleed if something gets wet. So if you had a flood and you used a colored mat board, you might stain your artwork. We always in the art world are using very plain, uncolored, antique white, off-white, cream colors. In the United States, there's a test that's used a lot called the photographic activity test, known as the PAT test. And a lot of the archival companies in the US will advertise specifically that their materials have passed the PAT test. And that's another way to know that you're buying a good quality material. I don't know whether that's reached India yet or not in terms of archival suppliers. Hopefully someday it will. There are, countless different hinging types, hinging styles that can be used to hinge an artwork into a mat. These are just some examples of some different ones. Some of the hinges sit behind the artwork, some sit on top. This is sort of a unique style that has a little crossbar that goes through it, and you can use the crossbar to attach your object into the mat. My preference is always to try and use what I call non-adhesive hinging, which is where you actually aren't attaching a hinge to your artwork at all. You're coming up with sort of creative ways of doing cornering. And again, these are just numerous different techniques that people have come up with to mount artworks without using any adhesive at all. And one other little interesting thing that I love to show is traditionally most people have mounted artworks in the corners. If you're using corners, you might put it in all four corners. And you think that's sort of the safest way to do it. But actually, studies have shown that if you were to take something and mount it that way and turn it upside down, it's going to fall right out. Whereas if you put your attachments along the sides, it's a much safer way to mount your artwork in case of it getting turned upside down. But there is no one right way to hinge something. There are lots of different options. And the important thing is to know your object and look at your object and figure out what's going to be the safest and best way for your particular material that you're dealing with. And I just wanted to show this one little slide of this is what can happen if you use poor quality adhesive on your artwork. This is something that was just glued, lots of different artworks that were glued down. The adhesive over time has stained and caused this disfiguring yellow stains all throughout the art. So when I talk about framing and glazing, again, you have to be really careful what materials you're using. When I talk about glazing, that refers to whatever whatever you're using on the front surface in your frame, which can be either plexiglass, sometimes I think people call that perspex, or glass. If you have an artwork that it doesn't lie flat, and you feel like you need some extra space in your frame so that it doesn't touch the glazing, you can use spacers. These are some examples of different kinds of spacers that you can add into your frame. And then within the frame itself, these are going to be kind of the layers that you have. You're going to have your glazing on the top. You're going to have your mat board sandwich with your artwork in between. And then it's always a good idea to have a backboard. And the purpose of the backboard is to prevent any damages from happening from the back. If something were to accidentally poke into the back of the framed package, that would prevent the artwork itself from being damaged. And then finally, you want to seal up the back edges of your framed piece. And in that way you can prevent pests, bugs, dust from getting inside the frame itself. This is probably a little bit more detail than many of you want, but the wood of a frame can off-gas itself. It depends. Different species of wood are more acidic than others. So one thing you can do is, if you're really concerned about the acidity and the effect of the acidity, is you can cover the inside of the wood frame with tapes that will basically seal off the wood. Another thing that we sometimes do at our museum is, if we know we're traveling our artwork to some place that doesn't have a good environment, is we'll use these sheets called ArtSorb, which basically has a silica gel in it that can hold a specific relative humidity, and within about 20% on either side. So you condition it to about 50%, you put it in your frame, you seal up your frame, and now you've created a little micro environment, a little mini environment that's going to maintain at 50% no matter where it goes. So that's a material we use a lot at our museum. And finally, one of the last things that people don't really think about at all, but that's really important, are the exhibit case materials. A lot of exhibit case materials that have been used in the past are not good quality and not acceptable, and can actually off-gas what we call volatile organic compounds, VOCs. And sometimes even when you're trying your hardest and you are checking every single bit of material that you're using in your exhibition case, you can still have interactions that you're not aware of. And this happened at our museum recently. We had built a case for some metals, and suddenly a white crystalline deposit started growing on the surface of the metals. And this was because there turned out to be an interaction going on between an adhesive we used in the case and the wood that was used in the case. But this is also an important aspect within the museum world to preserving your objects, is knowing what you're making your cases out of and making sure that you're using good quality materials. What we do in the museum world to try and tell whether or not the material is good is we test it ourselves. There's a particular test known as the Audi test, which takes little metal coupons and puts the coupons near little samples of the materials you want to test, and puts it in a high humidity environment and looks for what reactions the various metals have. And if you get reactions, you know that's not a good material to use. It's really hard to keep up doing this sort of testing, because you can test a material, but who's to say next year whether the company is going to change how they make it, change the formulation of how they're making something. You don't always know, but you just have to do your best to try and use the proper materials. And then finally, the last thing I want to say is, for those who are ever loaning their artworks to other museums, or sending it to a friend or a relative, you really want to be careful with how you ship and crate your artwork. So it's, again, for a number of different reasons. One including preventing a lot of temperature and relative humidity fluctuations. So you want to have some padding and have it be sealed well enough that you can protect from those changes. And then also very important shock and vibration, as well as I don't know how the delivery companies are here in India, but in the United States, companies like FedEx and UPS are known for sort of throwing their packages around. So you really want to make sure that you've got a lot of protection so that if someone is mishandling your package, your artwork is protected. And this is actually an example of an artwork that arrived at our museum once with a very poorly made crate that you can see there's absolutely no foam, there's no padding, there's nothing at all to absorb any shock. And this was a clay-fired sculpture that had completely broken. So this part right here had been attached up to these sections. So I've sort of covered now the basics of the preventive conservation, and I thought just really quickly I'll get to the more interesting stuff of what else do conservators do. And one of the things that we do is we do a lot of research because, of course, we want to understand what are the objects we work with, how are they going to react into the environment, how are the materials that we're using to preserve them and treat them and restore them, how are they going to react to that. And then we're also really doing a lot of monitoring to see how things hold up over time. Examination is a really key part of preservation and conservation. And we use a lot of different light sources to examine artworks in our collection. So this is an example of using what we call a raking light that's coming from the side. It helps show the distortions in the cockling that's going on in this artwork. This is using what we call transmitted light from underneath. You can get information in transmitted light that you can't see with the naked eye. And then we sometimes also use ultraviolet light. So even though I was saying that ultraviolet light is damaging, it's a tool that we can use in conservation to reveal information that we, again, can't see with the naked eye. This is an example of a watercolor that under UV light you see this yellow fluorescence. This is what happens to zinc white when you look at it under an ultraviolet lamp. And so we've been able to identify that zinc white was used in the creation of this artwork. Hand in hand with examination is documentation. We've